Story 1. My children laughed when I moved into a trailer, until they learned to own the land under their mansion. I was sitting in a folding chair in the middle of my new living room, a 12x6 single-wide trailer that smelled faintly of plywood and fresh vinyl, when my oldest son's voice rang out over speakerphone. "Dad, you can't be serious. A trailer." He let out this exaggerated laugh, the kind that's meant to be shared with someone else in the room. And sure enough, I heard muffled chuckles in the background. His wife, maybe. My daughter. I couldn't tell, but I could feel the heat in my cheeks as if they were standing right there pointing. "You always said you'd never end up like one of those people," my daughter chimed in. "Guess things change, huh?" It was supposed to be a small, private conversation about my move, but somehow it turned into a roast session. I could hear the ice clinking in their glasses, the relaxed way they spoke to me, as though I were some washed-up joke. I said nothing for a while. Silence is my weapon when I'm angry. I just listened as they made cracks about my new neighbors, probably owning 5 broken-down cars on their lawns, or how they'd bring the grandkids over when it was safe. I'd never felt so small in front of my own children. They thought they were laughing at my poverty. They thought I'd been forced down here, stripped of pride and options, left to rot in a rusting box at the edge of some forgotten field. And maybe I let them think that for now. The thing is, they didn't know whose land I was on. When I hung up, I sat back in that squeaky folding chair and looked out the tiny window. From here, I could see the edge of the hill where the property lines ran. My land stretched far beyond that hill, rolling down into a valley and back up again until it kissed the horizon. And on that far horizon sat their mansion, their perfect, shiny, 6-bedroom dream home, built right there on my soil. But that part of story they had no idea about yet. The truth is, the trailer wasn't my first choice. I'd lived most of my life in the same sturdy farmhouse, a little worn down, but full of memories. My late wife, Carol, had a way of making it feel like a place that could hold us together, even when life pulled hard in the other direction. But after she passed, things shifted in ways I didn't expect. My kids, Ethan and Rebecca, were in their 30s now, with families of their own. They'd grown up with the kind of steady, middle-class comfort that I never had. I was proud of that. I thought I'd given them enough foundation to always respect where they came from. But Carol was the glue, and when she was gone, they stopped coming around as often. Texts became shorter, phone calls less frequent. They loved me, sure, but it was a distant, scheduled kind of love, fitting me in between soccer practice and dinner reservations. Then came the housing boom. Ethan called me one afternoon, voice brimming with excitement. "Dad, there's this plot of land that just came up for sale. Perfect for the dream house we've been planning. Close enough to the city for work, but enough space for the kids to run around." I knew exactly the land he was talking about. It wasn't just close to the city. It was the far side of my property. What my kids never paid attention to was that I owned more than just the old farmhouse. Carol and I had quietly bought up the adjoining parcels over the years. Good investment land, we always said. We leased part of it for grazing, another part for timber, and the rest? It just sat there, quietly appreciating in value. Ethan didn't ask if I owned it. He assumed, like most people, that if it was up for sale, it belonged to someone else. And I didn't correct him. Instead, I called my lawyer. The sale went through, but not to the developer Ethan thought he was dealing with. It went to me. I set up a small LLC, handled everything through an agent, and sold the building rights to Ethan at a sweetheart price. Land contract, no bank involved. They thought they were getting a once-in-a-lifetime deal. And they were just not the way they thought. For a while, it was nice. They'd invite me over during construction, show me the plans, brag about the walk-in pantry and home theater. Rebecca's kids would run around barefoot in the grass, and she'd talk about how they finally had space to host big family holidays. But here's the thing. Ethan and Rebecca both started to change once that house was finished. They were bigger, not in size, but in the way they carried themselves, the way they talked about money, about people like that, when they mentioned anyone without a high-end car. Suddenly, my farmhouse felt too cramped for Thanksgiving. I was subtly pushed to host fewer gatherings, then none at all. I was a guest in their new perfect life, but not the kind they were proud to introduce. And then came the blow. The farmhouse had been in my family for generations, but the upkeep was draining me. The roof needed replacing, the plumbing was failing, and I wasn't in my prime anymore. I decided it was time to downsize, but I didn't want to move to a retirement home. I wanted something simple, quiet, manageable. The trailer was a conscious choice. Cheap, low maintenance, and close enough to my land that I could still keep an eye on things. When I told them, I thought maybe they'd understand. That maybe, for once, they'd see that life isn't about appearances. But instead, they laughed. Not politely, not nervously. They laughed like I confirmed some private joke they'd been making about me for years. That was the moment the last bit of warmth I'd been holding for them burned away. They thought this was about me losing dignity. They were about to learn it was about them losing everything. The night after that call, I barely slept. I lay in my narrow trailer bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. My anger had cooled into something sharper, calm, deliberate, and patient. People think revenge comes from heat, from sudden rage. They're wrong. The best kind comes from cold, slow realization. And I had just realized that I had been too generous with my kids for far too long. For years, I'd been paying the property taxes on that chunk of land their mansion sat on. Quietly, never mentioning it, never asking for anything in return. The land contract I'd given Ethan was set up so that I could reclaim ownership with 90 days' notice if certain clauses were violated, clauses he'd never bothered to read, because he assumed his father would never use them. I rolled over, reached for my phone, and started scrolling through old emails from my attorney. The original contract was still there. Every line was a little lifeline back to my leverage. The first clause, property maintenance, failure to keep the land in good, marketable condition, meant the contract could be revoked. I'd been to their house enough to know they didn't maintain half the landscaping they promised the HOA. The second clause, use of property, no commercial activity without written consent. And I knew Ethan had been renting out part of the place for wedding shoots on weekends. It was almost too easy. I didn't act right away. I kept visiting when invited, playing the role of the humble old man with his trailer life. I nodded politely when Ethan showed me his new outdoor kitchen, even when he made a joke about how it was probably bigger than Dad's whole living space. Rebecca was subtler in her digs, but they cut deeper. She'd forget to tell me about family events until after they happened, then send a cheerful photo of everyone smiling on the porch without me. One afternoon, I stopped by unannounced to drop off some tools Ethan had lent me years ago. They were hosting friends. I overheard him telling them, "Yeah, Dad just couldn't keep up with the old place. He's happier now, I think. Simpler life. Fewer responsibilities." His tone made simpler sound like pitiful. I walked away without knocking. The turning point came in early spring. I got a call from a neighbor who lived down the hill from their place. "Hey, just a heads up," he said. "Your kids are cutting down trees on your side of the line. They're saying it's to improve the view from their back deck." I drove out there the next day. Sure enough, a handful of old oaks were lying on the ground, stumps raw and bleeding sap. Those trees were on my land. Not leased, not sold mine. When I confronted Ethan, he laughed. "Dad, they were in the way. It's not like you were doing anything with them." "You don't get to decide that," I told him, keeping my voice low. "Come on, it's just trees. You've got, what, acres of them? Lighten up." That was the moment I decided to stop pretending. The next week, I called my attorney, Mr. Keegan, a man who'd known me for decades and had the patience of a saint, until someone tried to take advantage of me. I brought him the contract, photos of the felled trees, and a copy of the listing for Ethan's wedding venue services that he'd been advertising online. Keegan leaned back in his chair, reading through the paperwork. "You know," he said finally, "you could reclaim the land entirely. Not just find him, take it back. The way you structured this, well, I have to say, you were smart." "I wasn't trying to be smart," I said. "I was trying to be fair. But apparently, fair isn't what my kids respect." He tapped the paper. "If we move forward, you need to be ready for them to come at you hard. They're not going to take this quietly." I thought about the laughter on that call, the way they'd spoken about me like I was some embarrassment. "Good," I said. "Let them make noise. I've got more than enough rope for them to hang themselves with." Before we sent anything official, I decided to pay one last visit. I wanted to look them in the eye. They were on the patio when I arrived, sipping wine in the late afternoon sun. The kids were playing in the yard. For a moment, I felt that old ache, the one that made me want to keep the peace, to be the quiet, forgiving father who just absorbed every insult. But then Ethan grinned and said, "Hey, Dad, you should see this new sofa we got. Cost more than your whole trailer, I bet." That ache turned to steel. "I came to let you know," I said evenly, "that I've decided to make some changes to our agreement about the land. You might want to check your email in the next couple of days." Rebecca laughed. "Changes? What? Are you raising our imaginary rent?" Ethan smirked. "Dad, you've got your trailer. We've got our house. Let's not complicate things. I smiled. Not the warm kind. The kind that says you have no idea what's coming. I'll keep it simple, I said. It's my land. My rules. I left without another word. By the time they opened that email, the clock on their 90 days would already be ticking. The email went out on a Wednesday morning, drafted in the clean, clinical language only a lawyer can manage. Notice of breach of contract. The subject line read. The body outlined each violation in detail. Unauthorized commercial use of the property. Destruction of protected trees. Failure to maintain landscaping as per the agreement. It gave them exactly 90 days to either correct every violation and pay damages or vacate the property entirely. I knew they'd call as soon as they read it. I didn't answer. By noon, Ethan had left 4 voicemails. The first one was indignant. The second was confused. The third angry. The fourth quieter. Almost uncertain. Rebecca texted me. Asterisk, Dad, what is this? Is this some kind of joke? Asterisk. I didn't reply. 2 days later, they showed up at my trailer. I was outside, sanding down an old workbench I'd been restoring. Their SUV pulled up in a swirl of dust, and Ethan slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. What the hell is this? He demanded, waving a printed copy of the notice. It's exactly what it says. I told him, setting my sander down. You can't do this, Rebecca said, stepping forward. We bought that land fair and square. I met her eyes. No, you bought a contract for use of the land. You violated that contract, and now I'm exercising my right to revoke it. Ethan scoffed. You're kicking us out of our own house? Over some trees? Over a few weddings? It's not about the trees, I said, my voice steady. It's about respect, or in your case, the complete lack of it. Rebecca's mouth tightened. This is insane. Do you know how much we've put into that place? We've made it better than it's ever been. Better for who? I asked. For the people you host? The friends you brag to? Because you sure as hell didn't make it better for the person who owns it. They tried the guilt card next. Ethan's voice softened, almost pleading. Dad, we're family. You can't just take away our home. I let the words hang in the air. Funny, I said slowly. I don't remember you worrying about taking away my home when you laughed at me for moving here. That's not the same. It's exactly the same. I cut in. You think a roof over your head means security, but it doesn't. Not when you build it on someone else's foundation. Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. You're going to regret this. No, I said, picking up the sander again. I think you are. After they left, the calls started. Not just from them, but from my ex-son-in-law, mutual friends, even a couple of their neighbors. Apparently, Ethan and Rebecca had been telling everyone I'd lost my mind. That grief over Carol's death had made me paranoid and spiteful. The thing is, I didn't need anyone to believe me. The law was on my side. Mr. Keegan filed the necessary paperwork to enforce the contract. We even sent them an itemized bill for damages to the property, tree restoration costs, legal fees, and penalties for unauthorized commercial activity. It was more than they'd expected. Much more. Within a week, the polite conversation stopped. The threats began. Late one night, I got a call from Rebecca. Her voice was sharp, brittle. You're going to ruin us. Do you understand that? Maybe you should have thought about that before you ruined our family, I said. She went quiet for a moment. You're punishing us because we didn't what? Visit you enough? Throw you enough pity parties? I took a slow breath. I'm punishing you because you thought my worth ended when my house did. Because you forgot who helped you get where you are. And because you decided that the person who gave you everything could be mocked and discarded like an old coat. God, you're so dramatic, she snapped and hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time after. Dramatic? Maybe. But this wasn't theater. This was the real consequence of forgetting where you came from. By the 30-day mark, the tension was boiling. They'd started fixing things, patching landscaping, canceling the wedding bookings, but they still refused to acknowledge the tree cutting as a violation. Mr. Keegan assured me that was fine. Their partial compliance wouldn't stop the process. Ethan showed up again on day 31, this time alone. He looked tired, older somehow. Dad, listen, we can work this out. I'll pay you something. A fair rent. We'll stop the events. Just don't take the house. I set down my coffee and studied him. This was the first time in years I'd seen him without that air of certainty, that smug edge. You don't get it, do you? I said quietly. It's not about the money. It's about you learning that nothing in this life is truly yours unless you respect it. And you didn't respect me, my land, or the deal we made. He shook his head slowly, like he was realizing something for the first time. You're serious. As serious as you were when you laughed about my trailer, I said. When he left that day, I think he knew deep down that the fight was already over, and I wasn't done yet. By day 45, Ethan and Rebecca had gone from denial to full-on war mode. They hired their own lawyer, a young guy who clearly thought he'd stumbled into an easy win against some old man in a trailer. He sent me a thick packet of paperwork claiming I had no right to reclaim the land, that the violations were minor and non-material to the contract. Mr. Keegan read the letter with a faint smile. They're trying to bluff you, he said. Classic strategy. Pretend the terms don't mean what they clearly say, then hope you're too tired to fight. They've been underestimating me since this started, I said. I'm not stopping now. Meanwhile, the cracks in their perfect life started to show. My neighbor down by the main road called me again. You know, there's been a lot of shouting at your kid's place lately. Rebecca was in the driveway last night, screaming at Ethan about the mortgage. Something about how they can't afford to move. I couldn't lie. Hearing that made me pause for a moment. There was a part of me that remembered them as little kids, running through the farmhouse kitchen barefoot, their laughter echoing off the walls. That part of me wanted to forgive, to find a compromise. But then I remembered that phone call in the trailer. The laughter, the smugness, the way they'd turned me into a punchline for their friends, and that softness turned back into stone. On day 52, Keegan filed a formal eviction. 90 days was the legal minimum. There was no going back now unless I chose to withdraw it, and I wasn't going to. The news hit them harder than I expected. Rebecca called me in tears that night, her voice shaky and desperate. Dad, please, the kids don't understand what's happening. They think we're being punished for something we didn't do. I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't soften it either. Then tell them the truth. Tell them that their parents mocked their grandfather, destroyed his property, and treated him like he was worthless. Tell them actions have consequences. You're going to scar them for life, she cried. No, I said. I'm going to teach them something you never learned. Ethan took a different approach, anger. On day 55, he stormed into my trailer without knocking. You're out of your damn mind. You're willing to destroy your own family over a grudge. This isn't a grudge, I said calmly. This is a boundary, and I should have said it years ago. He paced a small space, fists clenching and unclenching. You think this makes you some kind of tough guy. All it's going to do is make sure we never speak to you again. I leaned back in my chair. Then maybe I'll finally get some peace. That shut him up for a moment. He stared at me, searching my face for a crack, some sign that I was bluffing, but there was nothing left to find. The next couple of weeks were quiet, almost eerily so. I didn't hear from them directly, but word trickled in through mutual acquaintances. They'd started quietly listing the mansion, hoping, I guess, to sell it before the eviction was final, so they could pay off debts and walk away with something. The problem? Keegan had already filed a notice of interest in the property with the county. Any buyer would see the dispute on record and think twice. The mansion was essentially unsellable until the matter was resolved, which meant until I got my land back, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Around day 70, Rebecca showed up alone. She didn't knock either, just stood at the bottom of my trailer steps, arms folded. I hope you're happy, she said, her voice cold. You've turned the kids against you. They think you're some kind of monster. I met her eyes. And what do you think I am? She hesitated. I think you're bitter and lonely, and this is the only way you can feel powerful anymore. I almost laughed. If you think this is about power, you still don't get it. This is about respect, and it's about teaching you that you can't treat people like garbage just because you think you're above them. She shook her head and turned to leave, but I called after her. Rebecca, you built your dream on my foundation, and when you spit on that foundation, you shouldn't be surprised when it crumbles under you. She didn't respond, just got in her SUV and drove away, dust trailing behind her. By day 85, the reality had sunk in. I drove past the mansion one last time before the deadline. The driveway was lined with moving boxes. The curtains were gone from the windows. They were leaving, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. I pulled over at the edge of the property, got out of my truck, and stood there for a while. The house was beautiful, no denying that, but it was hollow now, empty. Just another structure sitting on land that was mine. And soon, I'd decide exactly what to do with it. Because the thing about owning the ground under someone's feet is, Once you take it back, you get to decide who stands there next. And I already knew they wouldn't like my choice. Day 90 came on a gray morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and heavy, making everything feel quieter than it should. Keegan and I met at the property line, paperwork in hand. By the time we walked up the long driveway, the moving trucks were already there. The place looked stripped of its shine, garden beds overgrown, the immaculate lawn now patchy in places. The perfect veneer had cracked. Ethan was directing the movers, with a tight jaw. Rebecca stood on the porch, arms crossed, glaring at me like she could burn a hole straight through my chest. The kids weren't outside. I figured they were being kept away from the scene. "You won," Ethan said when I got close enough. "You happy now?" I looked around, taking in the sight of their life being packed into cardboard and plastic bins. "No," I said simply. "I'm not happy, but I'm satisfied." Rebecca let out a short, humorless laugh. "Same thing. Not even close," I said. The movers worked in silence, the tension so thick it felt like walking through smoke. I stood beside Keegan while he went through the formalities, handing over notices, signing acknowledgments. The process was clinical, but the weight of it wasn't lost on me. When the last paper was signed, Ethan stepped forward. "We'll never forgive you for this. You've ruined your relationship with us forever." I met his stare. "You ruined it the day you stopped respecting me. This is just the consequence." Rebecca spoke up then, her voice tight with fury. "You think you're teaching us a lesson? All you've done is prove you're petty and vindictive." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe one day, when you're older, you'll look back and realize that the ground you stood on was never truly yours, and maybe you'll remember what happens when you forget to be grateful for it." They left that afternoon. No hugs, no goodbyes, just the rumble of the moving truck disappearing down the road. I walked through the mansion after they were gone. It was still beautiful, even stripped bare. High ceilings, sunlight pouring through the big windows, polished floors that echoed with each step. But there was a hollowness to it now, an emptiness that felt fitting. I stood in the middle of the great room, looking out through the glass doors at the back deck. The view stretched down the hill to the edge of my land, the same view they'd cut those old oaks for. It hit me then. This place was never really theirs. They treated it like a trophy. But to me, it was just another piece of my land, something that existed because I allowed it to. And now, I could decide its future. The first call I made was to a local nonprofit that built transitional housing for veterans. They'd been on a waiting list for years, unable to find a property big enough for their project. When I told them I had 6 bedrooms for baths and a few acres to spare, they thought I was joking. I wasn't. By the end of the month, the mansion was full again, but not with wine glasses clinking or smug laughter drifting over the deck. It was alive with the sound of kids playing in the yard, of men and women rebuilding their lives, of gratitude instead of entitlement. I visited often, helped with repairs, fixed things that had been neglected. And every time I drove up that long driveway, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. Word got back to Ethan and Rebecca eventually. I don't know how they took it, and frankly, I didn't care. They'd made their choice when they decided my worth was tied to the house I lived in. I still lived in the trailer, still sanded my workbench in the afternoons, still drank my coffee on the little steps out front. Some people would call that a downgrade, but to me, it was the best seat in the world, because from there, I could look out across my land, past the hills, and know exactly what stood on it, and exactly who no longer did. And the sweetest part, every time they thought about that mansion, they have to remember, it was never really theirs. Story 2. They fought over my will before I even died. So I changed everything after hearing what my grandson whispered. I was still alive when they started circling me like vultures. It was a Sunday afternoon in my living room, sunlight spilling through the curtains, the kind of light that should feel warm and comforting. But all I felt was cold. My children and their spouses were huddled together in tight little groups, whispering behind their hands like they thought I couldn't hear. They didn't even bother pretending it was about anything else. My name was on their lips, my house in their eyes, my money in their minds. I wasn't sick enough to be bedridden, but the cane at my side and the creak in my knees must have made them smell weakness. I caught snippets of conversation, words like division, entitled chair, and how much longer do you think? I wanted to believe they were talking about something else, that my mind was just getting cynical with age. But then my daughter-in-law, Lisa, glanced at me and smirked, the same smirk I'd seen when she thought she'd won an argument at a family dinner. It was my grandson who broke me. He's only 11, Ethan. Sweet kid, the kind who still hugs me tight and calls me Grandpa without embarrassment. That day, he was sitting on the floor, fiddling with the edge of the rug, while his parents argued in the kitchen with my eldest daughter. He didn't see me watching when he leaned toward his cousin and whispered, "Dad says Grandpa's gonna die soon. Then we can get the big TV." I swear to you, it was like the air left my lungs. Not because of the TV. God knows, it wasn't about that. It was the casualness, the certainty, the way my death had become a casual milestone in their lives. Like I was just a hurdle they had to get over before collecting their prize. I sat there, staring at that boy who didn't even understand the weight of what he'd said, and I felt something in me harden. The truth is, I'd already made my will. Everything was to be divided evenly between my two kids, Mark and Anna, and I'd set aside some college money for the grandkids. I thought it was fair. I thought they'd appreciate it. I thought I'd raise better people. But that day, sitting in my own living room like an unwelcome guest, I decided something. If they were going to fight over my will before I was even in the ground, then maybe they didn't deserve to know what was in it. Maybe they didn't deserve a damn thing at all. I didn't say a word then. I just smiled when Lisa made her fake sweet comment about how she hoped I was getting plenty of rest. And I let Mark tell me, for the third time that week, that I should think about downsizing before the house became too much to handle. Downsizing was his code for sell the place and give us our cut early. After they left, I sat in my chair for hours, staring at the family photos on the wall. Smiling faces, birthdays, Christmases, people who used to be my whole world, people who once called me in the middle of the night just to talk. I thought about how those same people were now counting the days until my funeral like it was a holiday. That night, I pulled the will out of my desk drawer. It sat there in front of me under the warm desk lamp, a neat little stack of papers with my signature at the bottom. I poured myself a whiskey, neat, just the way my late wife used to drink hers, and I read it over. Every line felt wrong now. Every bequest felt like a gift to strangers wearing the faces of my children. The next morning, I called my lawyer. "Harold," I said, "I need to make some changes." He sighed. "Mark and Anna again?" That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't the first time he'd seen families like mine rot from the inside. "Yes," I said simply, "but this time, I want to make sure they don't see a penny more than they deserve. In fact, I want to make sure they think they're getting exactly what they want until the day I'm gone." He chuckled, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I started observing them more closely. Family dinners became reconnaissance missions. Phone calls were recorded in my mind like evidence. I wanted to be sure, absolutely certain, of who they were before I took the knife to my will. And what I saw, it only confirmed everything Ethan's whisper had cracked open in me. Anna started dropping by unannounced, her eyes darting to the jewelry box on my dresser when she thought I wasn't looking. Mark called constantly, suggesting that maybe I should prepay some of the inheritance as a way of helping out now. Lisa even had the gall to ask if she could borrow my late wife's sapphire necklace for an anniversary dinner. Not one of them asked how I was feeling. Not one offered to take me to the doctor. Not one offered to help with groceries or the leaking faucet in the upstairs bathroom. They wanted my things, not me. I started locking my bedroom door at night, not because I was afraid for my safety, but because I didn't trust them not to snoop while I slept. I kept the will in a new hiding place, one even they wouldn't think to look in. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized my real legacy wasn't in my money or my house. It was in the lessons I left behind. And right now, they were in desperate need of one. The kind of lesson that stings. And I knew exactly how I was going to teach it. The first step was patience. If there's one thing old age gives you, besides aching joints and an unshakable fondness for early dinners, it's the ability to wait. My kids were expecting me to make a move soon. Maybe sell the house or start arranging things so they could swoop in. I decided to let them think they were winning. I called Anna one afternoon and asked her to help me go through some old boxes in the attic. She showed up with coffee, a smile, and the kind of politeness that's paper thin. You can see the greed underneath if you hold it up to the light. She wasn't there for the memories. She was scanning every box like a hawk, pulling out trinkets and saying, "Oh, Mom would have wanted me to have this," before tucking it into her tote bag. I didn't stop her. I just made a mental note. A week later, Mark dropped by under the pretense of checking in. He brought Lisa and the kids, though it was clear he hadn't told them this was a quick visit. Lisa kept drifting toward the display cabinet in the dining room, her fingers grazing the glass, where my wife's crystal collection Saturday, you know. She said, "If you ever wanted to downsize, we could take some of these off your hands. Keep them in the family." I told her I'd think about it. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already bought a set of replicas online, identical enough to fool anyone who wasn't an appraiser. Every visit was a performance. I played the role of the gentle, fading old man, forgetful sometimes, generous to a fault, grateful for the attention. I let them believe they were softening me up. And all the while, I was working with Harold to build something airtight. The plan was simple on the surface. I leave the will exactly as it was, on paper. The big house, the bank accounts, the investments, they'd all be listed just like before. But here's the twist. By the time they read it, the assets they thought they were inheriting wouldn't be there anymore. The house, already transferred into a trust in someone else's name. The bank accounts, split into smaller accounts and quietly gifted to people who had actually been there for me over the years. My sister's children, my goddaughter, even my old fishing buddy's grandson, who helped me fix my fence last winter. The investments, cashed out and redirected to charities my wife loved. All perfectly legal, all invisible until the moment they tried to claim their inheritance. But I wasn't just planning to deprive them. I wanted them to know why. That's when I started the journal. Every evening, I'd write down the things they said, the things they did, the moments they revealed their true colors, the day Anna pocketed the old silver locket without asking, the time Mark told Ethan to make sure you're extra nice to Grandpa. It'll be worth it. The afternoon Lisa hinted that maybe I'd forget to mention certain assets to the tax man. I didn't write these in anger. I wrote them like evidence. Calm, precise, a record of what they'd become. Harold thought I was going too far. It's your money, your property, he said. You don't owe them anything. But this wasn't about owing. This was about truth. When I was gone, they were going to sit in that lawyer's office, hold the will in their greedy hands, and think they'd won. Then Harold would hand them the journal, and they'd read every ugly, shameful thing they'd ever done through my eyes. I wanted their windfall to turn to ash in their mouths. The strange thing was, while I was plotting all this, I started noticing other things. People I'd overlooked for years. The neighbor's daughter, who brought me fresh bread after her mom heard I wasn't feeling well. The young man at the grocery store, who always carried my bags to the car. Even Ethan, yes, the same boy whose words had gutted me, started to surprise me. One afternoon, when Mark was in the garage, helping me sort tools, translation, checking for anything valuable, Ethan wandered into my study. He didn't see me watching from the doorway when he picked up one of the photo albums. He sat on the couch, flipping through page after page, his little fingers brushing over pictures of my wife, of Mark and Anna when they were kids. He wasn't smiling like you do when you see something funny. He looked almost sad. When he noticed me, he shut the album quickly, like he'd been caught. I wasn't going to take it, he said. I know, I told him. He hesitated, then whispered, Dad says you're tired all the time now. I hope you don't get too tired to teach me how to fish this summer. And there it was, the first crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. Maybe Ethan wasn't lost yet. Maybe he was just repeating what he'd heard without understanding it. I didn't forgive him, not yet, but I tucked that moment away. Because as much as I wanted to scorch the earth, part of me wondered if I could still plant something in the ashes. The real question was, could I do both? I decided I could. If there was going to be a reckoning, it didn't have to be the kind that left nothing but salt in the soil. Some people, maybe just one person, might still deserve a chance to grow. Ethan was the only one I could picture in that category, and even then, I wasn't sure if I was seeing the boy he truly was or the boy I hoped he could be. The problem was Mark. My son was a man who never saw a dollar he didn't want to own. I'd seen that streak in him since his teenage years, when he'd borrow tools from the shed, and I'd find them listed for sale in the local paper. Back then, I thought it was just youthful opportunism. But now, as a man in his 40s, that greed had calcified into his character. If Ethan had any chance of growing up different, he needed to see that greed laid bare and punished. So, I began planting little seeds of my own. At dinner one Sunday, I casually mentioned to the family that I was reconsidering some of the items in my will. I watched the reactions ripple around the table like a drop of blood in water. Anna sat up straighter, Mark's fork paws midair. Lisa's smile stretched a little too tight. Oh, Mark asked, keeping his voice light. What kind of reconsidering? I shrugged, thinking about who's actually been here for me, who's helped me out in these last few years. I let that hang in the air like the smell of smoke. It didn't take long for the shift to happen. Suddenly, I was the most popular old man in town. Anna started calling every other day, always with some excuse, but never without a hint about the things she'd love to take care of for me. Mark began showing up to check the gutters. though I noticed he never actually brought a ladder. Even Lisa baked me a pie, though it tasted like she'd substituted sugar with spite. Ethan, though, he was different. His visits weren't filled with questions about my health or my belongings. He'd wander into the garage while I was tinkering, ask if I wanted to play cards, or bring me a drawing he'd made. It wasn't much, but it felt real. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a piece of him that saw me as more than a gateway to a bank account. One day, while the others were busy in the kitchen, Ethan sat next to me on the porch. He kicked his feet against the steps and said, "Dad's been nicer lately. He says we have to be because, well, you know." He stopped, glancing at me nervously. "Because what?" I asked, even though I already knew. He bit his lip. "Because you're older. And he says when people get older, you have to be nice, so they don't forget you when they go." There it was again, that casual cruelty, just like the big TV comment. Only this time, there was something else in Ethan's voice. A flicker of doubt, maybe even shame. I looked out across the yard and said, "Being nice isn't a payment, Ethan. It's not something you trade for stuff. It's something you do because you care. Do you understand?" He didn't answer right away, but when he finally nodded, it was slow, thoughtful. That conversation settled it for me. I was going to protect what mattered, not the money, but the lesson. Ethan would still get something, but only after he learned exactly what had poisoned the rest of them. The will's new version took weeks to finalize. Harold was meticulous, and I was grateful for that. On the surface, it still looked the same. Mark and Anna split the estate evenly. The grandkids got their shares, but each share had a condition. They could only receive it after reading and acknowledging the journal I'd written. And by acknowledging, I meant signing a statement that they understood my reasons. No signature, no inheritance. For Ethan, there was a second document, a letter sealed in an envelope, to be opened only after he turned 18. It contained the truth, that I'd seen something in him worth saving, that I hoped he'd choose a better path than his father, and that there was a trust in his name, waiting quietly, far away from the mess the others would wade through. I didn't tell Harold about the letter until the day we signed everything. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "You really think the boy's worth it?" I thought about the fishing trip we planned for the summer, the way his face lit up when he saw the old photos, the careful nod he gave me on the porch. "Yes," I said simply, "but he's going to have to earn it." By the time it was all in place, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew what was coming. There'd be fights, accusations, probably even lawyers, once they realized what I'd done. But I also knew they couldn't touch the heart of my plan. My revenge was in the truth, and I was leaving it in writing so it could never be twisted. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have predicted, was that the real fireworks wouldn't start when I died. They'd start the moment they thought I had, and that moment was coming sooner than I had expected. It happened on a Tuesday morning, one of those gray, rain-slick days when everything feels a little heavier. I was driving back from the grocery store when a delivery truck, trying to beat a yellow light, clipped the back of my car and spun me into a lamppost. The airbags went off, my ears rang, and the next thing I knew, I was in an ambulance with an oxygen mask pressed to my face. I was banged up, couple cracked ribs, a concussion, but nothing fatal. Still, by the time I got to the hospital, someone had already called Mark. That's when the rumor started. I don't know if it was the shock in his voice or the way he repeated my name over and over when he left me a voicemail, but by the time he hung up, I suspect even he wasn't sure if I was alive or dead. And instead of confirming anything, I stayed quiet. The hospital wanted to keep me for observation overnight, and I agreed. But I told the nurses not to allow visitors, not even family. I said I needed rest, but really, I just wanted to see what would happen when my absence became an open question. The answer came the very next day when I woke up to 3 missed calls from Anna, a flurry of texts from Lisa. "Are you at the hospital? What's going on?" And one particularly telling message from Mark. "If you can't talk, just let me know where the important papers are. I'll handle things." Handle things? The man couldn't even wait for a coroner's report before asking about my will. When I finally turned my phone back on that evening, the first voice I heard wasn't Mark's or Anna's, it was Ethan's. His message was short, almost hesitant. "Grandpa, I heard you got hurt. I hope you're okay. I don't care about the other stuff. I just want you to come home." That one message was enough to make me smile through the ache in my ribs. When I was discharged the following afternoon, I didn't call anyone. I had a taxi drop me off at the back entrance of my house, so no one would see me. And sure enough, as I rounded the corner into my driveway, I saw Anna's car parked out front. The curtains in the living room were drawn, but not all the way. I peeked through the narrow gap. There they were, Mark, Anna, and Lisa, standing in the middle of my living room, going through drawers, not checking anything, not tidying up, searching. Lisa had one of my old lockboxes on the coffee table, fiddling with the latch. Anna was flipping through folders for my desk. Mark was on the phone with someone, pacing and gesturing toward the hallway that led to my study. I don't think they saw me, and if they did, they probably thought I was some nosy neighbor. I backed away, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the clarity of it all. This was no longer about greed and whispers or sideways glances. This was trespassing. This was looting. I could have stormed in right then, demanded to know what they thought they were doing, but that would have ruined everything. No, I needed to let this play out. I needed to let them think they were getting away with it. So when the truth came crashing down, it would crush them completely. That night, I stayed at a motel on the edge of town. I called Harold and told him everything I'd seen. "Do you have proof?" he asked. "I don't need proof," I said. "I just need a good memory and a better plan." Over the next week, I set the trap. I didn't tell them I was fine. I didn't return calls. I let the rumor of my death, or at least my hospitalization, hang in the air. Neighbors asked about me. I told them I was recovering quietly and preferred privacy. Word would get back to my family eventually, but by then, the damage would be done. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got a text from Anna. "We need to talk about arrangements. Call me when you can." Arrangements. Not how are you feeling, or do you need anything. Just arrangements. That same afternoon, I heard from one of my neighbors that Mark had been over to check on the property twice already. When I asked what he'd been doing, she said she'd seen him carrying boxes out to his truck. I almost laughed. He really thought he was ahead of me. By the end of that week, I had everything I needed, dates, times, even a few photos from a neighbor's security camera showing Mark hauling my things away. It was more than enough to justify the next change in my will. One Harold helped me draft with no hesitation. The part that made me grin? I wasn't removing them completely. I was leaving them exactly $1 each. Enough to make it legal, enough to make it sting. And when they asked why, Harold would hand them the journal. They wanted to treat me like I was already dead. Fine, I'd show them what it really meant to be left with nothing. The following Sunday, I decided it was time to make my return. I didn't announce it. I just pulled into my own driveway at noon, carrying a bag of groceries and moving slow enough that I could take in every detail of their faces when they saw me. Mark was in the garage, rummaging through a stack of boxes. When he turned around and saw me standing there, alive, upright, and glaring, he went pale. The wrench in his hand clanged to the floor. "Dad, you're home," he stammered. "Sharp observation," I said, brushing past him into the house. Anna was in the kitchen, her hand halfway into the cookie jar where I kept spare keys. Lisa was sitting at the table with a manila folder open in front of her, my folder from my locked desk drawer. The silence when I stepped inside was almost funny. They froze like kids caught stealing candy, but the candy was my life. I didn't yell. I didn't ask what they were doing. I just set my groceries on the counter and said, "You'll want to put those back exactly where you found them." Mark tried to recover first. We were just organizing, in case I died. I asked, my voice low. No one spoke. Lisa glanced at Anna, who suddenly found the floor very interesting. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a fight. "Out," I said, pointing toward the front door. Now, Mark tried to puff himself up. "This is ridiculous. We were just trying to help." I set out. My tone left no room for argument. They left in a huff, muttering to each other, no doubt already trying to spin the story, so they were the victims. But I didn't care. I had what I needed, confirmation that they had no shame left. That night, I pulled Ethan aside. He'd been quiet during the whole encounter, sitting in the living room reading while his parents searched my things. I told him I needed to talk. We sat on the porch, the air heavy with the smell of rain. "Ethan," I said, "I know what your dad and Ed have been doing. I know you've seen it too." He nodded slowly. "Do you understand why it's wrong?" I asked. He hesitated. "Because it's stealing?" "Yes, but it's more than that. They're not just taking things, they're taking trust. Once that's gone, it's hard to get back. Sometimes you never do." He stared at his shoes. "I don't want to be like them." That was the first time I felt certain I was doing the right thing. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Then you won't be. But it's going to take patience. Can you keep a secret?" He looked up at me, eyes wide. "Yeah, I can." So I told him, not everything, but enough. Enough for him to know there was something in the future meant for him alone. something he'd have to grow into. I told him it depended on him being a better man than the people in that kitchen. Do you promise? I asked. I promise, he said, and I believed him. Over the next few weeks, I made sure the trap was set tight. Harold and I finalized the will with the $1 clause. The journal was bound, dated, and sealed in an envelope with instructions that it be opened in the presence of both Mark and Anna. The trust for Ethan was secured, with the condition that he'd only learn the details after his 18th birthday. But here's the thing, when you live with a secret that big, you start to notice every moment that could blow it wide open. I began watching my kids more closely than ever. They grew more desperate, their visits more frequent, their smiles sharper. One afternoon, Mark came over alone. No Lisa, no kids. He sat across from me in the living room, his hands clasped like he was about to deliver bad news. Dad, he said, I've been thinking about you when you're gone. I just want to make sure everything's smooth. No surprises. I sipped my tea. Surprises. He forced a laugh. I just mean, you wouldn't want Anna trying to fight me over stuff. Maybe it's better if you, write her out now. Keep it simple. I set my cup down. You're asking me to cut your sister out of the will. He shrugged. If it makes things easier for you. What I didn't say was that the decision had already been made, just not in the way he thought. That night, I wrote one final entry in the journal about Mark's visit. I wanted it fresh in my memory when the time came for them to read it, because when they did, I wanted them to see exactly how far they'd fallen. And that time was coming faster than I expected, because just a week later, I got a letter in the mail, a legal notice that would change everything. The envelope was heavy, thick with documents, and bore the return address of a law firm I didn't recognize. I sat at the kitchen table, slit it open with my pocket knife, and slid the papers out. The first page was a formal notice. Estate of / my full name, petition for probate. I frowned. That wasn't possible. Probate only starts after someone dies. The second page was worse. It was a petition filed by my own son, Mark, requesting to be appointed executor of my estate on the grounds that I was incapacitated and unable to manage my own affairs. He'd even included a proposed inventory of my assets, right down to the make and model of my car. I kept reading, each paragraph like a punch in the gut. He'd claimed I'd been mentally declining for over a year, that my neighbors had expressed concern about my ability to care for myself, that I confused dates and lost track of personal property. Lies, every single one of them. By the time I reached the last page, my hands were trembling, but not from fear, from rage. Mark wasn't just circling the inheritance now. He was trying to take control of it while I was still breathing. I called Harold immediately. He's trying to put me in the ground without a funeral, I said, shoving the words through clenched teeth. Harold sighed heavily. I've seen this before. It's called a preemptive grab. They claim you're incompetent so they can manage your estate. And by manage, I mean drain it. What do we do? I asked. We fight, he said simply. You'll need to show up in court, present evidence you're perfectly capable. And if we're lucky, we can have the petition thrown out. But it might get ugly. Ugly didn't scare me anymore. In fact, part of me welcomed it, because now I had a chance to look my son in the eye, in front of a judge, and show him that I wasn't the frail old man he wanted me to be. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later. I didn't tell anyone except Harold. I went about my days like nothing was wrong, even invited Mark over for dinner twice. Both times, he smiled that thin smile of his and asked subtle questions about whether I considered simplifying my finances. Each time, I just nodded and said, all in good time. Meanwhile, Harold and I gathered evidence. Bank statements showing I paid my own bills on time. Doctor's notes confirming I was in good health and mentally sound. Even testimony from neighbors who'd seen me out gardening, fixing my fence, or driving into town without issue. The morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit, the same one I'd worn to my wife's funeral, and polished my shoes until I could see my reflection in them. When I walked into that courtroom, I wanted no one, not the judge, not Mark, not the strangers in the gallery, to see a man on his way out. I wanted them to see someone fully in control. Mark was already there, sitting with his lawyer. He didn't meet my eyes at first, but when the judge called the case and I stood, straight-backed, steady, he finally looked at me, and I saw it, that flicker of doubt. The judge asked me a series of questions, my name, my address, the date, even the current president. I answered each without hesitation, adding little details to make it clear I wasn't just reciting facts. When he asked about my finances, I produced my meticulously organized binder, each page labeled and tabbed. By the time it was over, the judge's tone had softened. He turned to Mark. "Your petition lacks sufficient evidence. I'm denying it, and I'll advise you, sir, to consider the damage this may have done to your relationship with your father." Mark's jaw tightened. He mumbled something to his lawyer, gathered his papers, and walked out without looking at me. I stayed seated for a moment, letting the victory sink in. This wasn't just about keeping control of my estate. It was about sending a message. They thought I was vulnerable. They thought they could shove me aside and take over. Not yet. Not ever, if I had my way. Outside the courthouse, Harold clapped me on the shoulder. "That was masterful," he said. "You've still got plenty of fight left." I smiled, more than they realized, because now I knew exactly how I was going to end this. The will, the journal, Ethan's trust, it was all still in place. But I was going to add one last piece. Something public. Something that would make sure everyone knew exactly who my children were before they got so much as a whiff of my estate. It would take careful timing. And as fate would have it, the perfect opportunity was coming up, my birthday. I hadn't expected the relief that came from finally saying it all out loud. But as the silence settled in the lawyer's office after I told my kids exactly why I'd done what I'd done, I felt lighter than I had in years. Martha sat stiff in her chair, arms crossed so tightly across her chest I thought she might crack a rib. James leaned back, rubbing his jaw like he was trying to decide whether to be angry or embarrassed. And Carol just looked away, cheeks flushed, eyes blinking quickly like she was holding something back. "That's quite the story, Dad," James said finally, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But if you think one sob story about Mom's illness gives you the right to blindside us like this, you're wrong. We're still your kids." I tilted my head at him. "And when I needed my kids, where were you?" My voice didn't rise. It was calm, level, the kind of tone my father used to use when he wanted me to really listen. "When your mother was in the hospital, barely able to hold down food, I asked for help. Just some time, a few visits, maybe a meal. All three of you made excuses. You said you were busy, that you didn't want to see her like that, that it was too much. But it was never too much for me. I was here every day. I didn't walk away." Carol's eyes shimmered, and for a moment I thought she might apologize. But she pressed her lips into a thin line instead. "I never said I didn't care," she whispered. "Maybe not with words," I said gently. "But you said it with your actions." Martha scoffed, shaking her head. "So what, this is your revenge? You couldn't just tell us how you felt. You had to go and punish us? That's sick." I leaned forward, my hands resting on my knees. "It's not punishment. It's protection. Your mother didn't want her last gift to become fuel for more selfishness. She wanted it to mean something. That's why I followed her wishes to the letter. You think I enjoyed watching you three bicker about what you thought you were owed while she was still alive?" The lawyer cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Turner," he said, "perhaps we should continue with the documentation." "Not yet," I interrupted, never taking my eyes off my children. "I need you to hear the rest." Because there was one thing they didn't know. One thing I hadn't told anyone, not even our closest friends. Your mother didn't just leave behind a will. She left a recording. Their expressions shifted, curiosity fighting with defensiveness. I wasn't going to play it, I admitted. But maybe it's the only way you'll understand. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. The lawyer looked surprised, but took it and plugged it into his laptop. The moment her voice filled the room, every other sound vanished. "My darlings," she began, her voice soft and warm, though you could hear the strain. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. I want you to know that I loved you, all of you, even if I didn't always like the choices you made." James's jaw tightened. Martha glanced away. Carol froze. "You didn't come around much in those last months. Maybe it was too hard to see me that way, but it was harder knowing you weren't there. Your father was my rock. He gave up everything to take care of me, without asking for anything in return. And so, I wanted my final gift to go to the person who truly earned it." Her voice wavered, but she kept going. "This isn't to punish you. It's to remind you that love isn't about what you're owed. It's about what you give, freely, even when it's inconvenient, even when it hurts. I hope someday you understand, and I hope you forgive yourselves." The recording clicked off. No one spoke. For a long time, the only sound was the faint hum of the lawyer's computer. Finally, James stood. I need some air." He walked out without another word. Martha was pale, her hands trembling slightly. She really said that? Carol's voice cracked when she finally spoke. I'm sorry, Dad. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. It's not me you need to apologize to. The meeting ended shortly after, but I knew this wasn't the end. Far from it. The real test was still coming. Whether my children would choose to learn from this, or let the bitterness swallow them whole. I was about to find out. The air in the lawyer's office was heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. The will had been read. The terms were clear, and there was no going back. But instead of storming out or slamming the door, my daughter sat quietly across from me, her hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. My son stared at the floor like a man who'd just realized he'd been walking the wrong road for years. No one spoke for what felt like hours. Then, finally, my daughter's voice broke the silence. Dad, I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was barely above a whisper, but it cut through me deeper than any insult ever had. I looked up, expecting her to be defensive, but instead, her eyes were glossy, her lips trembling. We laughed because we thought you were running away from life, from us. But the truth is, we were the ones who ran first. We stopped calling, stopped checking in. I don't know when we became so entitled. She swallowed hard. I forgot you were a person, not just Dad or a wallet. My son cleared his throat, his voice rough. I told myself you were stubborn, hard to be around, but I think I was just mad at you for not giving me what I wanted. I forgot that you gave me so much already. I sat there, my hands clasped in front of me, heart pounding. For months, I'd replayed every cruel word, every moment they dismissed me, every slight I'd buried deep. I'd convinced myself they'd never understand. And yet here they were, two grown adults, stripped of pride, speaking to me like children again. You know, I said slowly. The trailer wasn't about punishment. It was about peace. I wanted to live somewhere no one needed anything from me. But if I'm honest, I missed you both every day. They both looked at me then, their expressions softening, something shifting between us. I took a deep breath. The land is mine. That won't change. But the truth is, I don't want to be the kind of man who dies with bitterness in his heart. I want Sunday dinners again. I want my grandchildren to know me, not some story about a stubborn old man in a trailer. My daughter reached across the table first, her hand warm over mine. My son followed, his larger hand covering both of ours. It was awkward, a little clumsy, but it felt right, like we were stacking stones to rebuild a bridge we'd let wash away. We talked for hours after that, about mistakes, about pride, about the way grief can turn love into distance without anyone meaning for it to happen. I didn't forgive everything in that moment, and I don't think they did either. But we started something, and as we left the lawyer's office, my daughter looped her arm through mine and asked, "So, Sunday, I'll make that roast you love." For the first time in years, I said yes without hesitation.